The prairie was merciless. It spread out under September sky in a stretch of gold and brown that had once promised plenty, but now gave nothing but dust. What little rain had fallen that summer had been swallowed whole by the cracked earth, leaving fields dry, cattle ribs showing, and families counting kernels of grain instead of bushels. At the edge of that land stood a small homestead, its fence sagging, its barn tired, its garden bare. And inside that weathered house sat Clara May Hollis, widow, mother of two, and for 7 days now, a woman with no food left to give. She crouched near the ashes of fire that had burned out 3 nights past, staring at the blackened wood as though willing it to spark again. The room smelled of smoke and dust, and her boys, Eddie and Thomas, lay curled under patched quilts, their cheeks hollow and pale. Every breath they took seemed fragile, like it might not last. 7 days. 7 days since the last crust of bread was gone. 7 days since she'd scraped the bottom of the flour sack and licked her fingers for crumbs. 7 days of silence broken only by the faint whimper of children trying not to complain. Her body ached with hunger, but her heart ached worse. A mother could go without. She had gone without. But children weren't meant to know this kind of hunger. Clara pressed a hand to her chest where her heart beat weakly, as though it too was starving. She thought of her husband, William, buried 2 winters past on a hill that looked down over the prairie. He had been gunned down by thieves for the sake of a few coins and a horse. Clara had buried him herself, breaking the frozen ground until her hands bled. And since then she had fought to keep the land, fought to keep her boys, fought to believe tomorrow might be better. But tonight, after 7 long days without food, she felt the weight of surrender pressing against her shoulders. She rose unsteadily and pulled her shawl tight, stepping outside into the chill night. The stars blazed cruel and bright. So far above her, they seemed another world entirely. She stumbled to the fence, gripped the splintered rail, and finally, after holding it back for so long, she let the sound tear out of her. A cry, not neat, not restrained. A cry ripped from the deepest part of her soul, full of grief and rage and helplessness. It echoed across the prairie like the howl of a wild thing. It carried into the darkness, where only the wind and the coyotes listened. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the dirt, her tears carving lines down her dust-stained cheeks. Miles away, that sound reached the ears of a man who knew too well what it meant to be alone. Elias Boone had been sitting on his porch when he heard it. His ranch sat near the hills, a good ride from town, far enough that loneliness was his only companion most nights. His cattle grazed thin on the dry range, and the silence of his cabin had become a second skin. He was a tall man, worn from years of work, his face roughened by wind and sun. His wife, Anna, had died in childbirth long ago, taking their unborn child with her. Since then, he'd buried more than he dared to love. Friends to fever, kin to bullets, neighbors to the land itself. He had grown accustomed to solitude, but he had never grown immune to sorrow. That cry had struck through the night air like a blade, straight into his chest. He froze, his pipe half raised, and listened. Coyotes yipped faintly in the distance, but above them, clear and human, was the sound of despair. Elias rose slowly, his chair creaking behind him. Something old and heavy stirred in him. Memories of nights he'd wished for someone, anyone, to hear him when his grief was too much to hold. Nights when the silence answered him instead. He could ignore it. The land was full of troubles that weren't his to fix. A man could ride himself into ruin trying to answer every cry. But this one felt different. By dawn, his mind was made up. He saddled his horse, slung a small sack of provisions across his shoulder. Flour, dried beans, jerky, and mounted up. He didn't know exactly where he was riding, only that it got told him to follow the echo of that voice. The prairie stretched wide and empty around him, but he kept on, eyes on the horizon. Each hoofbeat carried him closer to something he couldn't yet name, something more than duty, more than charity. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was a chance to keep another soul from knowing the same kind of silence that had once broken him. And so Elias Boone rode toward a widow's cry. The sun was slow in rising that morning, as if reluctant to cast light upon the prairie's harshness. Clara may tighten the frayed shawl around her shoulders and pushed open the cabin door. The air bit sharp, tinged with the scent of dust and dry sage. Her legs ached from weakness, but she carried the empty bucket toward the well anyway. Some part of her clung stubbornly to routine, as though dipping a bucket into nearly dry stone would trick her heart into believing tomorrow might still come. Her boys stirred in the barn. Eddie coughed, the sound ragged in his small chest. Thomas murmured something in his sleep. She dared not wake them. Better they dreamed than face hunger again. The handle of the bucket slipped in her trembling hand. She gritted her teeth, willed herself steady, and looked up. A rider. At first she thought her eyes deceived her, that hunger and sleepless nights had conjured vision out of the wavering morning light. But no, the figure grew clearer. A man on horseback, riding steady, not like a drifter passing by, but with purpose in his every stride. Her heart hammered in her chest. Fear and hope tangled together until she could barely breathe. Out here, a lone rider could mean salvation or ruin. She clutched the bucket tight and planted her feet. The rider slowed at the fence line. Dust trailed behind his horse, the animal's coat gleaming dully under the sun. The man in the saddle tipped his hat, his movements unhurried, deliberate, like one who understood the caution of strangers on the open land. "Ma'am," he called, his voice carrying deep and steady. "Name's Elias Boone. I heard a cry last night. Sounded like it come from this way." Clara's throat closed. Her face burned hot with shame. That cry, that raw, broken sound, had been hers. She had never intended for anyone to hear it, let alone a stranger. Yet here he was, bearing witness to her desperation. She wanted to deny it to keep her dignity. But lies wither fast in the face of hunger. Her lips parted, and a whisper barely louder than the breeze escaped. "It was me?" Her voice cracked. The words came out small, brittle as dry twigs. Elias dismounted with the ease of a man born to the saddle. He kept a respectful distance, his broad frame solid against the prairie's emptiness. He didn't stare, didn't crowd her. His eyes, though, were steady gray, like storm clouds that promise rain. "Are you in need?" he asked. The question undid her. Her knees trembled. Her grip on the bucket faltered. She wanted to stand tall, to answer with pride, but pride couldn't feed her boys. The truth spilled out, broken and bare. 7 days, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the dirt. 7 days without bread. The boys, they've had nothing. The bucket clattered against the stones of the well. Clara caught herself against the wooden frame, her fingers clutching the splintered edge. Elias's jaw worked, but he said nothing at first. He looked past her, toward the barn, where 2 thin faces peered through the slats, wide-eyed with both fear and curiosity. He shifted his hat, then untied a small sack from his saddle. "Here," he said simply, setting it on the fence post between them. Clara blinked. Flour, dried beans, jerky. Her body cried out at the sight, every muscle urging her to seize it. But her pride rose, bitter and stubborn. "I can't pay you," she whispered. Elias studied her a long moment, not unkindly. "You'll pay me by keeping those boys alive." The word struck her like a blow and a bomb all at once. Her hands trembled. She pressed them to her mouth as tears welled, hot and stinging. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry again, not in front of her children, not in front of a stranger. But the dam broke. "Why?" she forced out, choking on the question. "Why ride out here? Help someone you don't know?" Elias shifted his weight, eyes narrowing at the horizon as though searching for words there. His voice, when it came, was rough-edged, carved out of old hurt. "Because once I cried out too, and nobody came." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the restless shuffle of his horse. Clara stared at him, at the man who had brought hope back to her doorstep, and felt something stir inside her chest. It wasn't trust yet. Trust took time. But it was more than she'd felt in 7 long days of despair. Elias picked up the bucket she had dropped and lowered it into the well, drawing what little water it still held. He handed it to her, without ceremony. She took it, her hands brushing it just briefly, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the warmth of another's kindness. Behind them, The boys crept closer, drawn by the smell of food. Eddie clutched Thomas's hand, his eyes too big for his thin face. Elias crouched low, holding out a piece of jerky. He didn't press, didn't coax, just waited. Slowly, Eddie reached out and took it, clutching it like treasure. Clara's throat tightened. This man, this stranger, had stepped into their misery and offered not pity, but simple, steady help. For the first time in 7 days, she felt something stir that she had thought buried with her husband. Not quite hope, not yet, but close enough to make her believe she might live to see another sunrise with her boys. The boys ate first. Clara insisted. Elias had built a fire in the yard, stacking the wood neat and steady as if the simple act itself was a kind of promise. The smoke curl blew into morning air, carrying with it the scent of beans boiling in the pot he'd brought. Clara sat on the step, her hands folded tight at her lap as she watched Eddie and Thomas eat. Their small fingers trembled as they scooped beans from the tin bowls, their eyes darting between the food and the stranger who'd given it. Eddie chewed fast, afraid it might be taken away. Thomas stuffed his mouth, then slowed, savoring each bite as though afraid it would be the last. Clara's tears slid silently down her cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness, but Elias pretended not to notice. He kept the fire steady, his broad back a wall between her and the raw memory of hunger. When at last the boys slumped against each other, bellies round and heavy with more food than they'd had in a week, Clara rose and walked to Elias. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You saved us." Elias shook his head, eyes on the flames. "Just share what I had. You're the one who kept them alive this long. That's no small thing." Clara studied him. The man was rough-hewn, his face lined by years of wind and labor, his hands scarred. Yet there was gentleness in the way he stirred the fire, in the way he'd handed food to her boys without a word. The next days passed like something out of a dream. Elias didn't linger always. He came and went, bringing supplies from his ranch. Flour, salt pork, a pair of blankets too big for his own cabin. Clara tried to refuse at first, but Elias silenced her by setting her to work. She patched his shirts, darned his socks, baked bread from his flour. It wasn't charity. He told her it was trade. But Clara saw the truth in his eyes. He wanted her pride left intact. Each evening, he lingered just long enough to mend a fence post or draw water from the well. The boys began to follow him like shadows, peppering him with questions about horses, about cattle, about the world beyond their sagging fence. Elias answered in his steady, patient way, and Clara felt her heart ache at the sight of her son smiling again. But hope, fragile as glass, brought with it fear. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the prairie in blood and gold, Clara stood at the fence, her shawl pulled tight around her. Elias leaned beside her, arms folded, watching the horizon as if it held secrets. "I don't know how to trust this," Clara admitted at last, her voice trembling. 7 days ago, I thought we'd die. And now you're here, bringing food, fixing fences, making the boys laugh. I'm afraid if I believe it, it'll be taken away." Her words hung in the dusk, raw and unpolished. Elias turned his head slowly. His gaze was steady, storm gray, the kind of eyes that had seen more than they ever spoke of. "I can't promise the world be kind," he said, his voice rough with truth. "The land takes. Life takes. You know that better than most." He paused, then added softly, "But I can promise I won't walk away if you cry out again." The promise was simple, almost plain, yet it struck Clara deeper than any vow she had ever heard. Her breath caught, and she looked down, afraid he might see the tears gathering in her eyes. The boys came running then, their laughter carrying across the yard. Eddie clutched a wildflower in his dirt-streaked hand, its stem bent but its petals still bright. He thrust it toward Clara. She took it gently, pressing it to her chest as Thomas tugged at Elias's sleeve, begging him to show them how to whistle through a blade of grass. Elias crouched, patient as ever, showing the boy how to hold a blade just so. The whistle that came out was shrill and clumsy, but Thomas whooped with delight, and Eddie joined in, his small chest heaving with laughter. Clara watched them, her hand tightening around the flower. Something inside her, long buried under grief and hunger, shifted, Not quite love, not yet, but the stirrings of something she had thought dead forever. Later, when the fire burned low and Elias prepared to mount his horse, Clara stepped forward. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, and her voice came quiet but sure. "Thank you," she said, "for answering when no one else did." Elias paused with one hand on the reins. His eyes met hers, steady as stone. "Wasn't just your cry I heard, Clara. It was my own years back. I just didn't know it until now." He tipped his hat and rode off into the dark, but Clara didn't feel the ache of parting. For the first time in 7 days, longer perhaps, she felt the spark of something greater than survival. Hope. It lingered in the laughter of her boys, in the steady promise of a lonely rancher, and in the fragile wildflower pressed against her chest. The silence of despair had been broken, and on the edge of the prairie, a widow and a rancher began, slowly, cautiously, to believe that maybe God had not turned his face away after all.